Now, to start, we start with a very intriguing scenario for the main character, Alexander Hale. This woman walks up to him who specifically states that she is an American, and his order was to prioritize an American, but he did not follow that order. He chose to save the child. What's up, everybody? Going to start trying to review another streaming show. Not that I think a lot of people are watching said show, but I do want to start checking out some newer shows and maybe giving them some reviews. Though, much like when I review reality television, when I'm reviewing scripted television, if I don't like it enough, I will just stop covering it. So that's a possibility. Even for this show, even though this show does have a lot of questions that I want to see answered and see how they really pull everything together, today we are talking about the Copenhagen Test TV series streaming on Peacock, which is like a sci-fi spy thriller, I would say. The concept of the show was interesting to me because in real life we have crazy billionaires trying to put chips in brains so that the brain can act as like its own computer. And in this show, they are doing similar things with these agents within the government. But the question is, what happens if said chip in your brain is hacked? And so the main character on this show is getting hacked, and the hackers can see everything the main character, Alexander Hill, can see and hear. So the concept is intriguing. Now, there is a lot going on that is a more sci-fi realm that is also intriguing to me, but it's quite a big undertaking for a show to have this concept, to have an ensemble cast, and put it all together in 8 episodes and not only keep the plot interesting, but also make us care about the characters. It's something that interests me the most when it comes to writing, which is why I talk about writing a lot here on the channel when talking about soap operas usually. But it's also very interesting with these shows that only have a few episodes, because how do you write everything in 8 episodes and pull it off? So we're going to see if this show does pull it off. Now, to start, we start with a very intriguing scenario for the main character, Alexander Hale, starting in Belarus, where Alexander is with his military team. They're on a mission to save hostages. And Alexander has a commando when saving people, because there is a catch. There is only one spot on the helicopter that he is in, and he gets the orders to prioritize any Americans that he finds on the ground. But then he comes across a child who is not American and wants to save the child. Then this woman walks up to him who specifically states that she is an American, and his order was to prioritize an American, but he did not follow that order. He chose to save the child, and I guess was hoping that someone else would save the American woman that came to him. So we have this scenario to start the series, which I think is like one of those scenarios you think about sometimes, or you ask people to think about, like, what if you only had the chance to save someone you're related to, or 10 people that are about to be hit by a train? How do you make said choice? Well, Alexander's choice was to save the child and go against his orders, and it hurt him within the government organization that he was trying to work his way up into. Now, this is the big concept of the show, where the show is saying that under George W. Bush's presidency, he wanted a watcher to be made within the intelligence community. And so this secret government organization, the orphanage, was born, where they would not be known by other government agencies such as the FBI or the CIA. They would be watching to make sure that the FBI and the CIA are doing what they are supposed to do. But there is also people within the orphanage watching each other. And so that kind of builds the question within this series of who can you really trust, which is pretty typical of spy series, of course, or any kind of series that deals with the government. Alexander has also been suffering from panic attacks because I think a lot of it had to do with that night where he had to make the decision between the kid and the American woman. Turns out, though, that whole scenario was a test by the agency. It wasn't a real scenario. They were testing him to see if he would follow orders. He did not follow orders, and that is why he has been struggling to make his way up in the upstairs of the orphanage. So Alexander is our main character. We learn he has an ex-fiance. We see him talking to this bartender named Michelle that he seems to be getting close to. But what's happening within the orphanage, while his personal life is also not going well, the orphanage is having problems because agents on missions are being killed, and it seems like their covers are being blown, which means there might be a leak within the orphanage. And so everyone is kind of on edge, trying to figure out who might be the leak within the orphanage. Our main character, Alexander, is Chinese American, so there are already questions about his loyalty, which I think will play a big part of Alexander's personal story within the show. He already feels like he has to work extra hard to prove his loyalty. As the first episode goes on, we learn that people within the orphanage are already keeping quite the eye on Alexander. We see him being watched on several different cameras while he's talking to the bartender Michelle, because it turns out that it seems as though Alexander has indeed been hacked. And if he was already looking at classified documents and learning about the Copenhagen Test, then the hacker might already have seen a lot of files that shouldn't have been seen. So all these other officials within the orphanage have to decide if they need to leave the hack open or maybe even have to kill Alexander or try and take the chip out of his head, which can also kill Alexander, but it also means he could never work for the government again. He decides to keep the hack open, which means he's basically going to have to be controlled by the higher ups within the orphanage. They are going to have to control everything he sees and everything he hears so that A, the hackers think that they haven't been found out, but also B, the hackers can't get any information that the orphanage don't want the hackers to get. So it is kind of a high concept here with the whole hacking of a person's brain. That's what the first episode has a lot to do with. I'm also reviewing the second episode today. We'll only be talking about episodes 1 and 2. I'll talk about the other 6 episodes in the future, whether anyone watches this or not, or is watching the actual episodes. The good thing about episode 2 is we get further backstory. We also learn that the bartender Michelle is a part of this whole operation too. She is there to try and test Alexander's loyalty. Alexander also doesn't quite realize right away. I was a little confused in the second episode because we're jumping back in time from where the first episode ended. But it turns out that Michelle is also the woman that was in the woods in Belarus when Alexander had to make that choice, and he didn't choose her, the American. She was a part of the Copenhagen Test. So there's some development with that character. We also meet Parker, who had been kicked out of a few different departments because her reports were too detailed, and nobody would really want to listen to all of these details, even though her details were probably highly accurate. So they have recruited Parker into the upstairs of the orphanage to make her analyze Alexander. Parker gets a lot of time in this episode as we see her trying her best to analyze Alexander because the higher ups want her to give them 7 words or less about what Alexander actually wants in a way to prove he can be trusted or just to prove himself to be a normal human being. While Michelle is still trying to be the date for Alexander, they end up at a library because I guess there's some, at the library the hackers can't really hack there. There's something at the library that blocks the signal from the hackers. We get our first like action of the show during these scenes when someone on the orphanage's side and somebody who might be a hacker end up getting into a fight, which leads to Alexander and Michelle also having to fight to get out of that situation. This is when Michelle has to admit to Alexander that she is basically a part of this big old scheme that they are now all involved with, and also admit to being the woman in the woods that night when Alexander was being tested. So we're going to see those two characters probably get closer. I don't know if it will lead to some sort of romance, but it very well could, because the thing that Parker summed up about Alexander in 7 words or less was that he wants to build a family. And I think the show's probably going to dive more into him being a Chinese American and what family means to him. So we can get better, or at least good, character development there. This first episode, the first 2 episodes, very plot heavy, but I also feel like they have to be plot heavy because the plot is so big. There's a lot of things to cover. But the second episode helped with character development, not only with Alexander, but with Michelle and with Parker too. And I think that's what the show needs to do. We're going to have this ensemble cast. And yeah, Alexander is our main character, but he's also perhaps our main antagonist too, because he's the one being hacked. So we need to care about the ensemble cast too. Another character at the end of episode 2 is Cobb, I believe his name is, who also works at the orphanage, who has been friendly with Alexander, but doesn't believe Alexander now that Alexander is lying about what he's actually doing at the orphanage, because the higher-ups need him to lie, because even fellow agents within the orphanage can't know the mission that he's actually a part of. Cobb is meeting at the bar with someone that is saying he's his uncle, basically, and Cobb is telling his uncle that he doesn't trust Alexander. Another character involved in that ending scene of episode 2 is basically Alexander's only friend within the story so far, which is this former spy turned chef named Victor, who was actually Alexander's mentor. So I don't know why Victor is meeting with Cobb and this guy that's saying he's Cobb's uncle. So yeah, there's these other characters, and that's kind of asking the audience again, who can really be trusted on this show? And I guess that's what we will have to figure out as we go along. So the first 2 episodes they're fine. They're not bad at all. They're good enough. Some of the middle of each episode gets a little bogged down in all the plot details. But I think as the show goes on further, hopefully we can continue to flesh out characters and also flesh out the big plot. And I hope they could actually put it all together and make a good show out of it, because the potential is definitely there. The sci-fi element can make for very interesting potential for a longer series because of the whole hacking element, the whole brain chip element. Although there's only so far you can really go with that. The real sci-fi deal to me that's interesting is just the orphanage as a whole. I do think there are several seasons you can get out of this type of story. It's kind of comic book like. Obviously the main character, whose name I'm not going to pronounce because I'll butcher it, is part of the Marvel universe. So not surprising to see him in this comic book like TV show. hoping the show continues to interest me enough to keep covering the rest of the series. I don't know if any of you are checking it out or will check it out, but that's my thoughts so far on the first 2 episodes.